A Chinese essayist writes that hope is like a path in the countryside. Originally, there's nothing, but as people walk this way again and again, a path appears. The proverb teaches us two essential truths. First, that the way toward that which we most desire often remains elusive to us until we are staring it directly in the face. And second, that we are the ones that set the course. While it's true that the path of hope appears in the place where we once could not fathom it, we know that the path does not simply sprout out of nowhere. It takes people walking this way again and again and again, and only then does the path become inevitable, because we made it so. 5784 was a year where a path towards hope was not so viable, was not so visible. Our paths, they didn't resemble the perfect perfection and orderliness of the Garden of Eden, but rather the unruliness and the chaos of the Sinai Desert. Of course, so much of this chaos began just a few weeks into the new year on October 7th. I remember the morning of October 7th in this room, the disorientation of it all. Learning about what was unfolding from congregants coming into the synagogue, worried about my family in Jerusalem, deeply worried about our Jewish family all over Israel. And while I had very little idea what was happening, we know it would take weeks and months to really understand fully what was happening. I had a clear sense that day that whatever it was would change Israeli society and Jewish history forever. It was actually a really windy and disorienting day in Baltimore as well. Emily and I returned home that afternoon, eating lunch at a friend's house, and as we walked by the side of our house, we noticed that our sukkah that was on the side of our house fell over into the street. Now we had to pull it up. The walls collapsed for the safety of the drivers going by. But it was clear to us that our sukkah, our symbol of God's embrace, remained destroyed, resting on its side for the remainder of the day and the remainder of the holiday. I remember arriving at Simchat Torah services that evening. Now with the benefit of some more news, a bit more time to breathe, but everything felt upside down. There was discussion about if it would be prudent or even possible to dance with the Torahs that evening. I felt so deeply the question of the psalmist, Ech nashir et shir Adonai al admat nechar. How can we sing a song to the Lord on alien soil? The psalmist originally wrote these words in exile, by the waters of Babylon, reflecting on the ruin of a destroyed temple. How would the Jewish people continue to pray, continue to sing, when their pathway to God had been obliterated? At Beth Am, we tried to dance. We thought perhaps that the consistency, the familiarity of the liturgy would see us through this uncertain moment, just as it had so many times before. On Simchat Torah, we always dance, so this year we would dance as well. For me, it all became a little too much. And at one point during our dancing, I excused myself and I walked around the corner of the synagogue and I began to cry. For how could we sing to God in our strange new land? Where was the hope in this moment of destruction and of death? This year has been disorienting. Too often it's felt like our sukkah has fallen down and is sitting on its side. It's been unclear where our protection, where our redemption might come from. There's too much to say to recap all of the feelings of this year. The feelings of heartbreak and anger and fear and concern. I remember so clearly every moment of my own trip to Israel back in April, sitting and crying with survivors of the attacks, bearing witness at the border communities that had been destroyed, sitting across a conference table with a father who had spent the last months doing everything he possibly could, every minute of every day, to bring his sons home from captivity. So many other people, so many other stories. I remember spending time by the Gaza border, mourning those who had been killed or taken captive on October 7th, praying for all of those who had been taken hostage, all while hearing bombing in real time happening across the border in Gaza. I've had a lot of time to think about this trip, about the stories that I heard and the people that I met. But I've also been thinking about all the people that I didn't meet, that I couldn't possibly meet. Every Israeli we met had just experienced the very worst moment of their entire life. They were doing everything they could to hang on, to protect themselves, and to care for their families and their communities. I felt that if I had experienced that kind of devastation, I would hope that I would not want any other person to experience that same kind of pain. Not ever. Not in Israel, not in Gaza, not anywhere. This year of uncertainty, this year where violence has not only been thrust upon our families and our communities, but this year where we've also had to encounter the effects and impacts of violence, have been deeply disorienting. And when Israel's attacked, and when we feel this horrific rise of anti-Semitism, it often feels like the only response is to hide away, to close in ranks, to run behind the synagogue, and to cry. This is not the moment when we feel the desire or the ability to look at the bigger picture. It's the moment when we want to shout the fragment of Pirkei Avot, "If I'm not for myself, who will be for me?" Even those who really want to care about both innocent Israelis and Gazans found it nearly impossible. It can lead to compassion fatigue. It does lead to compassion fatigue. A condition when it becomes simply too much to take on the additional trauma of another while dealing with the trauma of our own. But here, of course, lies my worry. My worry that if we allow ourselves to shrink into ourselves, if we allow ourselves to accept the cynicism of this moment, that we will have done exactly what Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran wanted. And we'll lose touch with our core Jewish instinct that all humans are created equal, that all humans are of infinite worth, created b'tselem Elohim in the image of God. If we let ourselves believe that this violence is the eternal and the inevitable cost of Jewish security, we will have abandoned our search for our path to hope. We've seen the terrible images of Israeli communities destroyed, families displaced and living in constant fear, too many children living with PTSD. We pray each day for hostages violently taken from us still in captivity. And we've also seen the horror of daily images of Gazan communities that have been leveled. Pictures of nearly 2 million people who have been displaced over and over again from their homes, according to the United Nations. The 1 million Gazans who are being exposed to famine, according to food security experts. And the children, the 14,000 Gazan children who have been killed, with more than 20,000 missing, countless more severely injured. Judaism urges us and encourages us to hold onto the pain and suffering of all of humanity. And when we're unwilling to do this, when we give into the nihilism of this moment, we reject the hope that our tradition demands. When we refuse to highlight Gazan civilian casualties of this war along with Israeli casualties and hostages, ashamnu, we've sinned by refusing to treat all humanity as created in God's image. When we don't use our American voice to advocate for just conduct in the war on all sides, we've sinned in treating violence cavalierly. And when we say that Jewish safety means eliminating any critique of the war, when we teach our children that this kind of violence is simply the way that it is, Asham. We've sinned by abandoning our hope and by not using our voice to imagine a more peaceful way forward. There are moments in which I want to hang on to Jewish sovereignty and security and push the rest to the background because I so deeply care about my people. And yet, I know that my Zionism demands a care for Israel that is not incompatible with the concern for all humanity. I'm a Zionist because I believe in the hope of Hatikvah, of Israel's national anthem, as it reads, to be a free nation in our own land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. And I'm also a Zionist because I believe in the promise of Israel's Declaration of Independence, that Israel will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants, that it will be based on the precepts of liberty and justice and peace taught by the Hebrew prophets, and that it will uphold the full social and political equality of all of its citizens without distinction of race or creed or sex. I'm a Zionist because I love Israel and because I love our people. Some of my cousins are actual Israelis, but all Israelis, I feel, are my cousins as well. If we can't promote a Zionism that takes seriously the need for security and self-actualization, along with a commitment to democracy and human rights, if we can't maintain that Zionism should live up to the full range of Jewish values in order to be a free and safe nation, then we will be following a Zionism that's become a parody of itself. And we'll be living a Judaism that's a shadow of what Judaism is meant to be. It's a Judaism that doesn't use power judiciously, that follows leaders who don't have the public interest in mind, a Judaism that asks us to ignore those who are suffering instead of reaching out our hand. Some have suggested that this desire to raise a wider awareness about the scale of violence, both in Gaza and in Israel, it's simply a debate between universalism and particularism. A debate between an older generation who saw the foundation of the state of Israel and knows what's necessary for its protection, and a younger generation less committed to those notions and more committed to an interconnected 21st century world and its universalistic ideals. For me, this doesn't feel like the choice. Caring about violence and advocating for its end, it's not because of a leaning towards universalism over particularism. For me, it comes directly out of my Jewish values and my Jewish family. That the Jewish people are meant to be a light unto all of the nations. That our chosenness, it's not born out of our special qualities, but out of our particular responsibility to each other and to the world. So where do we find the hope among such despair? Well, I think directly from the Rosh Hashanah liturgy. The Torah readings on Rosh Hashanah ask us to consider that there are more paths to liberation when we try to see our world as expansively as possible. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we read the stories of Abraham and Sarah, of Hagar and Ishmael. Sarah notices that her son Isaac and Hagar's son Ishmael are engaging in some sort of dangerous activity which the Torah calls mitzachek, playing. She immediately instructs Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. And this morning on Rosh Hashanah, we read the story of Abraham willing to commit the most horrific violence, sacrificing his son in order to follow the command of God, until he stopped at the very last moment. The stories read together tell a story of Abraham, a man who is challenged by God to put aside his rationality and to do what is necessary to follow his God. He becomes, as the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard most famously named him, the knight of faith. And perhaps if the main character of these stories is Abraham, the lesson would be much clearer. That we should do what is painful but necessary, protect our family above all else. But what if the main character of these readings is not Abraham, but is God? God is the one who prevents death in both stories. God is the one who 2 times helps the most vulnerable see what is at first unseen. God is known in these stories not by violence, but instead by rachamim, by compassion. In the first story, Hagar finds herself abandoned in the wilderness with only a crust of bread and a small skin of water. Fairly quickly, the food and water supply is diminished, and Hagar, desperate and with no options, abandons her son Ishmael under a bush. She starts to leave him, finding the idea of watching her son die unbearable. But something causes her to stay close. She sits within earshot as Ishmael bursts into tears. And God hears Ishmael's cry, and a messenger of God comes and speaks directly to Hagar. But instead of performing a miracle of reviving the boy back to life, instead of simply refilling the skin of water and the bread, God does something fascinating. The Torah teaches, "Vayifkach Elohim et eineha." God opened up Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. The medieval commentator Radak writes that in opening her eyes, God expanded her range of vision so that she could see the contours of what previously she could not see. Suddenly, the path had appeared. And in today's parsha, as Abraham is about to release the knife, an angel stops him. The angel doesn't untie Isaac, doesn't even really block the knife. Instead, the angel forces Abraham to pause and to lift his eyes. And when he lifts his eyes and turns around, he sees a ram caught in the thicket, an acceptable offering that before he could not see. The stories of Rosh Hashanah remind us that even in the moments of our greatest despair, hope is still possible. That the story can end with life and not with death. So what does it mean to see the fullness of this very moment? To hold onto a hope that continues to remain elusive? I think it's probably going to be a little bit different for each of us. For me, it's meant engaging in the work of organizations like Women Wage Peace, the largest grassroots peace movement in Israel, committed to a holistic view of security, which embraces political sovereignty and military strength, but also economic security and education and personal safety. It's meant contributing to organizations like the New Israel Fund, which are working to build an Israeli civil society that can hold the needs of all of Israel's residents across lines of faith and race and class. These are the kinds of organizations that they're Zionists. They care deeply about a Jewish state. And they know what kind of hope in action it will take to make Israel strong. For me, this has meant praying for our hostages each and every day, for all of the innocent civilians who have been killed in this war. It's meant advocating for the international community to work with Hamas and Israel to make a deal that will finally end this war and will bring the hostages home. It's meant continuing to teach that all lives are infinitely valuable and that all of us are created in the image of God. And it's meant that in our teaching and our learning and our praying to not give up hope. To not believe that violence against civilians is the inevitable cost of security. To believe that we can pray and act towards a better way. It's meant advocating for a Zionism that I can be most proud of. Where I found my deepest and greatest source of inspiration is from Israelis themselves. I was so moved by the words of Rachel Goldberg-Polin, who even after the murder of her son Hirsch, continues to push Israel to return the hostages, who sees that it will take all of us to build a brighter future in Israel. And I'm deeply moved by the family of Carmel Gat, another woman who was murdered along with Hirsch Goldberg-Polin and other hostages. The Times of Israel interviewed her family right after the IDF announced that the 2 terrorists who likely murdered her and Hirsch and 4 other hostages had been killed by Israeli troops. Her family wrote, "It would have made no difference to Carmel if those who murdered her or murdered her mother are alive or dead. She would have wanted to know that the hostages returned home alive. And then they added, there's no comfort in revenge. The answer to death is not more death, it's life. That's the difference between us and our enemies. Our enemies sanctify death, we sanctify life. If they can have that perspective, certainly we can try to as well. May this be the year that we sanctify life. May our hostages be returned home. I was going to say in this year, but hopefully in this month, in these days, hopefully today. May the violence finally end, not this year, but today. May this be the year that when we turn around, we can see the well of water that has been elusive for so long. And most important, may we continue to trudge through the wilderness, ever hopeful, until our path towards liberation finally appears. Shana Tova.